So today I will be discussing the main themes outlined in my recent book that was just published called Diagnosing Desire, Biopolitics and Femininity into the 21st Century. And I will also describe what I've termed the feminized responsive desire framework within the new science of female sexuality. This new science is a contemporary trend in sexual medicine that has been posited as feminist. However, while I do not doubt the intent of the clinicians who claim to be feminists, I do doubt that endlessly studying women's responsive desire will ever amount to a truly feminist project. So I'll briefly outline the 5 facets of what I call the feminized responsive desire framework that I describe in my book. And then I'll explain why I find this framework problematic and ultimately quite retrograde and disempowering. And here I'm absolutely building off of the work of really both Stewart and Beck. So the first facet of the feminized responsive desire framework that I describe is actually encapsulated in this experimental photoplethysmographic research that Beck just described, which has been used to tell the truth of sexuality since the mid-20th century. So most of you watching this symposium will know that this instrument on the front cover of my book here is a vaginal photoplethysmograph. It's inserted into the vagina and used to measure lubrication, swelling, and vasocongestion, all of which are claimed to be objective measures of women's physiological arousal. These measures are usually assessed while participants watch pornography in a laboratory setting, and then these measures are compared to participants' subjective arousal. So as Beck mentioned, either how turned on they say they are or how much they are able to recognize how physically turned on they are. Studies that use this device consistently suggest that cisgender women, particularly heterosexual or androphilic women, are discordant. That is, they are said to have much free-flowing automatic physiological arousal. Previously mentioned sexologist Meredith Shivers once said that women have a rudderless system of reflexive physiological arousal, but they often do not subjectively detect it. The idea has been put forward that women are turned on by everything. In one famous study, even a film featuring bonobos having sex. And this lack of a true sexual orientation has been framed as an evolutionary adaptation. The infamous preparation hypothesis, which Dr. Jordan Young was alluding to, in which women are always already aroused as a protective mechanism against vaginal injury that might be incurred during cave rape. I'm going to go to my next slide here. So the second facet of the feminized responsive desire framework, and all of these facets are always described in all of the popular renditions and portrayals of this scientific research. So, part of this is the science and part of it is the kind of popular reception and portrayal for sure. But so the second facet of the feminized responsive desire framework includes new models of responsive or receptive desire, which have most often been applied to women, particularly at the turn of the 21st century. So it was around the year 2000 that Canadian sexologist Rosemary Basson famously developed her circular sexual response cycle model, kind of as an alternative to the human sexual response cycle of Masters and Johnson. And so this alternative model is portrayed here in this slide. And the important thing to pay attention to is the word receptive, the kind of sexual neutrality. Women they're neutral, they become receptive. And they kind of have to like prime themselves, or they're primed by a partner or an environment to become sexual. So in her seminal piece in which Basson initially discusses this model, and importantly, this is a model that's derived from research primarily with straight partnered cisgender women. Basson states, sensing an opportunity to be sexual, the partner's neediness, or an awareness of one or more potential benefits or rewards that are very important to them, but which are not necessarily sexual, women move from a sexual neutrality to seeking stimuli necessary to ignite sexual desire. This model, along with the incentive motivation model, which emerged around the same time in the Dutch context, was instrumental in shaping the new DSM-5 low desire diagnosis for women. So I will move on to that diagnosis, and I'll just show you a picture of the DSM. The third facet of the feminized responsive desire framework is the new female-specific low desire diagnosis in the DSM-5. Through the new diagnosis of female sexual interest/arousal disorder, or FSIAD, lack of receptivity has been instituted as a potential core component of sexual dysfunction in women. And so here I'm going to show you very briefly what the actual diagnosis looks like in the DSM-5. And if you look at number 3, you will see the criterion of typically unreceptive to a partner's attempts to initiate. This is only in the women's diagnosis. And there are other interesting aspects to this diagnosis that really set it apart from the male diagnosis. As a corollary to this receptivity criterion, sexual responsiveness has been brought forward as a metric for healthy female sexuality. And it is important to consider how this diagnosis discursively frames women as less driven than men are by spontaneous or internal sexual needs, more likely to engage in cost-benefit analyses as they consider possible non-sexual rewards or incentives to be gained from any given sexual act, and more likely to feel desire only or primarily when triggered by an initiating and tacitly male partner. For contrast, let's just take a quick peek at the men's diagnosis. This is male hypoactive sexual desire disorder. The 1994 HSDD diagnosis was retained for men. And importantly to note here, there is no receptivity criterion, and the key term desire is maintained for men. The word desire isn't mentioned once in the female diagnosis. And finally, not finally, but almost finally, the fourth facet of the feminized responsive desire framework that I describe in my book is the promotion of techniques to help women work on their low desire. So I have this cute white lady here balancing multiple things. She's multitasking. She needs to get in touch with her desire. She's lost it. So importantly, these techniques, they're really framed as a way for women to enhance their responsive desire and heal their discordance, to bridge the mind-body gap. So one of the most popular treatments at the moment is mindfulness-based sex therapy, or MBST. MBST paradoxically incorporates the Buddhist tenets of non-judgmentally being in the present alongside goal-oriented Western cognitive behavioral techniques. And many of the same practitioners who were involved in designing FSIAD for the new DSM-5, and who are also proponents of Bassan's circular sexual response cycle, have supported the use of MBST as a therapeutic tool to improve the low desiring woman's sexual response and help her enhance her ability to engage in sex. I'm not going to talk much about the interviews that I actually did with low desiring women, but I did 37 of them for my book, very in depth. And some of the women I interviewed in my book did describe MBST as a recipe for coercion by well-meaning clinicians, and also being encouraged to potentially meditate away their trauma or to just do it anyway, meaning have sex with their cis male partners even if they're not really into it. Notably, I think it's also important to mention that mindfulness here is work. So we might question why the solution to women's low desire is to add more work. Especially, I think, when the idea is also put forward that many women experience low desire because they are stressed out, overworked, and distracted in their daily lives, which is depicted in this slide here. So I'll leave the slides, and I will finish by, can you see me? By talking about my fifth and final facet very quickly. The fifth and final facet of the feminized responsive desire framework is the lack of feminist critique and activism leading up to the institution of the FSIAD diagnosis in the DSM-5. And this is the part that is discussed less often. During the development of what I call the feminized responsive desire framework in the first 2 decades of the 21st century, most feminist anti-medicalization activists, and here I am referring to groups like the New View campaign, were focused myopically on critiquing the pharmaceutical industry. The motto became down with big pharma, or down with Addy or Philanthropin, But the feminist focus here was so narrowly on preventing FDA approval of drugs marketed to enhance women's desire that everything else seemed to fly below the radar and get a pass. And here I am thinking that, the sleeping beauty models of women's sexuality, retrograde ideas about female discordance, a new woman-specific low desire diagnosis that ultimately posits women as rationally weighing up costs and benefits as part of a sexual calculus, and so-called alternative behavioral techniques for optimizing feminine desire. All of this flew below the radar. As long as it wasn't a drug, it was framed not only as safe, but as female-friendly and even as feminist. And anyone who was against Big Pharma could now claim they were a feminist as well. If I'm being generous, I would say that this is a weak and ineffective feminism. If I were to be harsher, I would say it is actually a fairly Western-centric, bourgeois, whitewashed, and cisheteronormative vision of sexuality and desire for men and for women. And one that in fact sneaks in some pretty retrograde ideas about natural feminine harmony, empathy, responsiveness, and flow. Really all the motifs of second wave cultural feminism, but that it sneaks them in through the back door of a contemporary neoliberal feminism. There is no question that sexual medicine, science, therapy, and sexology of the past have been not only sexist, but also racist, classist, and otherwise hegemonic. But how much has changed with the contemporary new science of female sexuality? This is what I seek to answer in my book. If we are to move beyond reductively gendering desire today, we must consider that there is more to gender than, well, gender. Gender, as it is conceived within and arguably produced via sexual science, always also has a race, a class, a cisness or a transness, a sexuality, a geographical or national origin or location. If we are to stop inappropriately and inaccurately gendering desire, if we are to have a responsible and nuanced feminist orientation to desire, we must consider who the woman is, who is the subject of sexology. In what ways and to what end is this person a woman? Or are women actually conjured up and called forth by the very tenets of the feminized responsive desire framework? Even a sexology that calls itself apolitical and atheoretical, as the DSM-5 calls itself, does in fact have a politics, and in posturing as atheoretical, in fact, sets forth a theory. Briefly, the 5 facets of the feminized responsive desire framework together produce women with low desire as a category of study, a population, and a public culture or mode of address. People who are treated as women and who are uninterested in sex have very few avenues at their disposal by which to make sense of that lack of interest in sex today. So much of the time, they come to think of themselves as biologically lower in desire because they are women, or they come to see themselves as naturally receptive and responsive because they are women. Science doesn't only explain things or people, it also brings them into being. We must denaturalize the category women with low desire, what has morphed into women with responsive desire, and possibly even the category woman itself, as these have been articulated via sexology, sex therapy, and the alternative sexual self-help sphere. And particularly as these categories are so thoroughly whitewashed, bourgeois, cisheteronormative, and founded in the global north and via colonialism. Why must we dismantle the feminized responsive desire framework and de-gender desire? Because the stakes are high for lots of people who do not fit into these normative categories, yet who have no other language by which to make sense of themselves and their experiences. And I will end there.